Then they have a whole set of microwave directions. That just blew me away that you could actually microwave a Pop-Tart. I mean, how long does it take to toast a Pop-Tart? A minute? If you want them dark? People don't have that kind of time. Listen, if you need to zap fry your Pop-Tarts before you head out the door, you might want to loosen up your schedule. And I swear it says microwave on high for 3 seconds. I don't think I want to wake up and be eaten in 3 seconds. The alarm goes off, put them in, ding, get out of here. If you're waking, eating, and hauling in 3 seconds, you're booking yourself too tight.
Well, good morning once again, everyone, and welcome to the Ransom. I'm so glad that you came. We're kicking off a brand new series today called Simplify. And we're talking about how to simplify our lives so that we can focus on the things that matter most. Now, in our last series, it was called Sent, and we went through the book of Acts, and we talked about the things that God is calling us to do and how He's sending us as a church out on mission. Well, this series is all about how we can adjust our lives so that we can actually do the things that He's called us to do. And so today we're going to talk about that area of our lives that makes it possible to simplify every other area. We're going to talk about how to simplify our schedule today. Now here's the truth. As your schedule goes, so goes your life. As your schedule goes, so goes your life. You see, your schedule has a direct impact on everything about you because your schedule is really your time, and your time is your most precious commodity. And so if your schedule is insane, you will likely also feel insane. Now, in 1928, there was an economist named John Keynes, and with all of the technological advances happening at the time, he predicted that sometime in the not-too-distant future, all of our technology would help us to work less than we did then. In fact, he predicted that by about this time, we'd be working only 3 days a week. He was a little off, wasn't he? In fact, the opposite has happened. Americans, we work more than any other country in the world. We work a full hour a day more than the second runner-up, which is Great Britain. Studies show that commuters in America are more stressed than fighter pilots and riot police. We take 20% of the vacation of other countries like Norway. I didn't say 20% less vacation. I said 20% of the vacation that other countries take. A third of Americans operate on dangerously low levels of sleep. In fact, one study showed that if you get less than 7 hours of sleep at night, then in terms of your ability to focus, it's like you've got a 0.1% blood alcohol level. The legal limit is 0.08, by the way. So, I mean, it's no wonder our kids are struggling in school. They're getting raised by a bunch of drunks, right? I got 3 kids, which means I got way less than 7 hours of sleep last night. I should tell you a little bit of something about to expect for the next... No, I'm just kidding. Now, many of us long for a simpler schedule. We think, yeah, more time to rest, more time to do the things I love, more time to be with my family, more time to spend with God would be amazing. But you know, it's just kind of a lie, isn't it? I mean, if I had 30 hours in a day, I'd fill it up with the same junk that I'm filling up my day right now. You know? See, the key is to remember this. A simpler schedule is not an issue of time, it's an issue of priority. It's not an issue of time, it's an issue of priority. Listen, a simpler schedule is not about doing less. It's about doing what's best. If we had 30 hours in a day, we'd still be microwaving Pop-Tarts for 3 seconds. It's about being able to prioritize your time in such a way that it doesn't get sucked away by meaningless things. And sometimes this might mean doing something that doesn't always appear to make sense. Now, today we're going to look at Mark chapter 5. And if you have a Bible, please open to Mark 5 with me. If you don't have a Bible, put your hand up and the ushers will bring you one. We'll be on page 602 of our church Bibles. I'd love for you to join me in the passage. Mark 5, we'll start in verse 21. In this passage of Scripture, we're going to learn a little bit about how Jesus manages his busy schedule. Page 602, Mark 5, starting in verse 21. It says, Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. Now pause for a second. Let's examine what's happening so far. Jesus, just before this passage, has just healed a demon-possessed man. And then he got into his boat and he went to the other side of the lake. And by the time he got there, there's already a crowd of people there waiting for him. So Mark is trying to tell us in this story that by our standards, Jesus has now achieved rock star status, okay? He's got an entourage. People, every time he goes somewhere, there's already a crowd there waiting for him. This means that anywhere that Jesus went, people wanted to be with him. He has no shortage of demands on his time. My guess is that every single one of those people in that crowd pressing around Jesus had an agenda for him. My guess is that many of those agendas were good ones. Jesus, my father is sick. Can you help? Jesus, I have no money for food. Can you help? Jesus, I need gas in my car. Whatever, any number of things that were legitimate needs. But out of the crowd, there emerges a man who falls at Jesus' feet and pleads with him. And he says, "My little daughter is dying. Come lay your hands on her and heal her so she can live." And it's interesting to me that of all the people in the crowd that are pressing around Jesus, this man named Jairus is the one who gets an audience with Jesus. There were probably tons of needs at the moment, but the fact is this man Jairus is a very important fella. The Bible says he's a leader of the synagogue. This means that he's the kind of guy who, when he steps into a crowd, people would step aside for him. Jairus is very important. And anyone reading Mark would think to themselves, okay, well, if Jesus is going to help anyone in the crowd, it's this person. Jairus is a leader in the community. He's respected by everyone. So, of course, Jesus is going to rush off and help him. And that's exactly what Jesus does. You see, Jairus is a very important appointment for Jesus. But as so often happens when we are in a hurry, when we have something important to do, Jesus gets interrupted. So let's pick up the story in verse 25. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Let's pause again here. Okay, just as Jesus is rushing off to help Jairus' daughter who was dying, he stops in his tracks for what seems to be the ultimate squirrel moment. You know what I'm talking about? It's like apparently Jesus has no attention span. A girl is dying, and then he stops because somebody touched him. And clearly the disciples are not impressed here. Jesus, there's 100 people touching you right now. Stopping and asking who's touching you is like asking who touched you when you're in the middle of a rugby scrum. It doesn't make any sense. We got important matters to attend to, Jesus. This is a silly question. You're on your way to heal a dying girl, the daughter of one of the most important men in town, mind you. We don't have time for this, Jesus. Come on, let's go. It's kind of like I go walking with my 3-year-old daughter sometimes, and she's just like, we'll stop all of a sudden, get down to look at a piece of grass. It's like, hon, we got grass in our yard too. Let's go, come on. But Jesus doesn't go. It says that he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Imagine that scene for a second. Your child is dying. The ambulance is on its way, but he stops because somebody honked at him. Imagine how exasperating that must have been. I'm guessing that's how Jairus feels right now. Now, this sermon is supposed to be on time management, how to simplify our schedules. But so far, the story doesn't seem to be helping us much, does it? It appears that Jesus is managing his time horribly. Well, don't worry, it gets worse. Verse 33, then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. So really, what happens here, believe it or not, the story actually goes from bad to worse. Let me explain. Okay, so imagine you're Jairus for a second. Not only did Jesus waste time asking silly questions, looking around the crowd for no good reason, but as it turns out, he did it for a woman who was ceremonially unclean. They had very strict religious rules at the time, and this woman was ceremonially unclean. She was basically nothing in that society. Leviticus 25 says that a woman who is bleeding is unclean for as long as it continues. In this case, it had continued for 12 years. For 12 years, she could not worship at the synagogue. She could not offer sacrifices. She could not enter the temple. She was ostracized from her community. The doctors had failed her, and this was her last desperate attempt to be restored to a normal life. So don't miss this. Mark wants us to see the difference here between these two people. One is a leader in the community. The other is an outcast. One is a religious elite. The other is ceremonially unclean and can't even worship. On his way to help the first, Jesus stops for the second. Now, we could talk about how remarkable it would have seemed that Jesus would stop for this woman. I mean, not only was she unclean, but by touching Jesus, she made him unclean as well. Everything about this is offensive. But that doesn't seem to bother Jesus. In fact, he commends her for her faith, and in this moment, Jesus takes everything his culture taught about who matters, and he flips it on its head. So this has a lot to say about how we view the people around us, but that's not what this sermon is about. It's about your schedule. So let's get back to it. Here's what I think this passage is telling us. You'll remember earlier I said that a simpler schedule is not about doing less, it's about doing what's best. Here's the second key. What's best is not always what's urgent. What's best is not always what's urgent. Jesus had two options before him. To continue on and help this man, to help Jairus, whose daughter was dying after all, or turn aside for a woman whom society had cast off. It's clear which is most urgent, but Jesus knew what was best in the moment. And so in that moment, he had to stop, he had to be interrupted, because he wasn't going to just heal a woman. He was going to do something that would change an entire culture. That's what happened when he stopped for her. You know, you and I read the story now, and we're glad that Jesus stops for the woman who's bleeding. We feel bad for her. We have empathy. You know why? Because our system of morals have changed because of what Jesus did that day. You and I, in fact, all of civilization has been affected by the things that Jesus did and taught, which means that when you and I come to the story, it's not scandalous that Jesus would stop for her. We're happy that he does. That's not the way they saw it then. If you would have been in the first century hearing this story, you would have thought, what in the world is Jesus thinking? You would have been offended. This would have been morally reprehensible that Jesus wouldn't rush off to help Jairus, but instead stopped for this woman who isn't even named in the text. Jesus completely challenged our idea of what's important, and he showed us that what's best is not always what's urgent. Stephen Covey is an author. He wrote a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about a time management matrix, and he says that we can divide our time up into 4 quadrants. So let me show you here. So quadrant 1, you've got the important and the urgent, okay? Crying baby, a kitchen fire, okay? So there's some important calls as well, but okay, if your kitchen's on fire, that's important and urgent. Quadrant 2, you've got more long-range sorts of things. These are the important things but aren't necessarily urgent. So like exercise, long-range planning, what am I going to do with my life, that sort of thing. Quadrant 3, the not important but urgent. These are random interruptions or distractions. And then number 4, the not urgent and not important. These are the things that we really don't need to pay much attention to at all. These are the time wasters. Now, Stephen Covey says that the people who are most effective have figured out a way to emphasize square 2. The important, but not urgent. You see, everybody needs to emphasize square 1. We all need to spend time at square 1. If your kitchen's on fire, you should probably pay attention. Nobody needs to spend any time in square 4, okay? A lot of us do spend more time than we should, but we don't technically need to. But here's the thing. Most of us spend way more time in square 3 than we need to. Effective people, he says, have figured out how to adjust their lives so they can spend more time on the important but not urgent things. So many of us go about our our lives with just kind of an end-of-the-day mentality. What do I got to get done by the end of the day? Other than what do I got to do by the end of my life? That's a square two question. So in square three, we have urgent things that aren't important, the things that we feel like we can't ignore, but they keep us from doing what matters most. The random interruptions, the emails we feel we just got to send right now, okay? The entertainment or our children's sports leagues or the chores that we feel like we have to do before our friends come over when really they don't care if we vacuum the carpet. And as a result, we never get around to doing what matters most. In square three, we are so busy doing good things that we lose time for the God things. We need to focus on square two, the important but not urgent, and realize that what's best is not always what's most urgent. That's the key to a simpler schedule. By the way, I'm curious. Ask yourself the question, what square is church in for you? What square is time with God in for you? Is it something you get around to if you have time? Because guess what? If that's the case, you ain't never going to have time. Something to think about. Now, here's the problem. Most of us are going to hear this whole thing about, focus on what's best and, what's best is not necessarily what's urgent. Most of us are going to hear that and we're going to think to ourselves, okay, that sounds great, but it's just not a reality for me. If I don't tend to the things that are urgent, everything's going to fall apart. It all depends on me. The truth is, that's kind of what it seems to be the case in Mark 5 as well. Jesus heals a woman, and here's what happens next. Verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. Well, this is catastrophic, isn't it? It would appear that Jesus completely mismanaged his time. Jesus, if you hadn't been putzing around for so long, asking who touched you, maybe you could have saved this little girl. But as is usually the case when it comes to Jesus, when it's over, it ain't over, right? So here's what happens. Verse 36, Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. And then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep. The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave. They took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. So this story has a happy ending, doesn't it? Everybody gets healed and everyone's fine. And I know what you might be thinking. You could be thinking, okay, well, that's great. I'm not Jesus. Last time I checked, I'm not the Son of God, which means that if I show up late and don't get things done, I can't just work a miracle to fix it and make it all better, right? Jesus has that luxury. I do not. I have to do it all. Now, there's one important thing, though, about this passage that we can't forget. Because, yes, Jesus' miracles are amazing, but they're not even the most fundamental truth to this story. The most fundamental thing going on here is about God's faithfulness. Let me tell you what I mean by that. You see, Jesus wasn't just a wizard with magical powers. Everything that he did through the Father. Everything he did was according to God's will. Listen, it was Jesus' unshakable trust in God's faithfulness that allowed Jesus to tend to the things that were best and not necessarily urgent. I'll even say that one more time. It was his unshakable trust in God's faithfulness that allowed Jesus to tend to the things that were best and not necessarily urgent. And so my question for you is, do you pray over your schedule? Do you pray over your time? My guess is that most of us pray over our health and our finances, but what about your time? Key number 3 is this: focus on what's best and trust God for the rest. I wish I could get them all to rhyme, but I'm just not that good. Focus on what's best, trust God for the rest. The truth is, your time is your most precious commodity. You have an unlimited amount of it. You don't even really know how much you have, right? We're all going to die someday, but we're not sure when. You have an unlimited amount of time, so we are called, you have a limited amount of time, so we are called to be diligent with it. At least on this earth, our time is limited, isn't it? So why wouldn't we pray that God would bless it? Why wouldn't we pray that God would use it to his glory? Why wouldn't we ask God to take our time and to do more with it than we could possibly accomplish ourselves? Why don't we lay out our time at Jesus' feet and say, Jesus, I'm not sure how I'm going to get this done, but I'm going to focus on what's best. I'm going to trust you for the rest. I'm not going to cheat my family. I'm not going to cheat my God. I'm not going to cheat the things that are important in life because I'm going to focus on the things that are best. And I'm going to trust that when I do that God will take care of the rest. You see, I believe that our crazy lives that so many of us live in this room, I think that they represent a very deep spiritual problem. The fact that many of us run around like insane people shows a lot about us, but the thing that it might show the most, and this is going to sound harsh, but I'll explain it, I think it shows that we are lazy cowards who lack faith in God. I'm talking about me right now. That we're lazy cowards who lack faith in God. That might sound a little extreme, but I think it's true. Listen, number one, we're not willing to do the hard work of saying no, so we're lazy. Number two, we're not courageous enough to be present and still with ourselves and the ones that we love, so we're cowards. And number three, we think that it all depends on us. We lack faith. Eugene Peterson makes this point. He says, the reason I become busy is that I am lazy. I indolently let other people decide what I will do instead of resolutely deciding myself. We are a people who microwave a Pop-Tart for 3 seconds. So it should come as no surprise if we have 3-second Pop-Tart prayer lives as well. Now, at first, it felt a little silly to me to use a story about a woman bleeding and a little girl dying to illustrate the importance of simplifying our schedules. Seems like a rather heavy story to preach on when we're talking about something so insignificant. But then again, maybe it's not insignificant. Because we have a Father whose heart breaks to be with us. And when we run around like chickens with our head cut off, it's as though he's calling out to us, but we're just stopping up our ears and shouting. Maybe our inability to stop demonstrates a spiritual sickness in us that we just don't want to face. One pastor that I like to listen to is named Steve Deneff, and he was talking about how slow God is. You ever notice that? God is slow, right? Like you could add that to all of his attributes, like omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, slow. At least by my standards. He never seems to do things early, does he? God is slow. And then Steve Deneff said this thing that just hit me right between the eyes. He says, the degree to which I am in a hurry is the degree to which I am most unlike God. And I thought, well, I'm really not like God much then, because I'm almost always in a hurry. We will never hear the voice of God when we're in a hurry. It's just not how it works. I took a seminary class that talked about addiction. And it talked about how we can be addicted to all sorts of things. And one of those things that apparently we can be addicted to is like busyness and activity. And so in one of the textbooks, it challenged us to sit perfectly still for like 10 minutes. And I thought, okay, well, I'll try it. And no kidding, I had a physiological reaction to sitting still. Okay, I'm sitting there, literally, you're supposed to sit still, just kind of try to focus on one thing. I'm sitting there, and my legs started to get all itchy, and then my body started to feel all squirmy, and my brain started to run in 1,000 different directions. I couldn't focus anymore. And in that moment, I realized I was addicted to activity. I couldn't even sit still for 10 minutes. And before you judge me, you should try it too. It's harder than it sounds. The question is, how do we focus on what's best? So I want to give 3 steps towards a simpler schedule. Step 1, we must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. We must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. This comes from an author named Dallas Willard. Another man named John Ortberg had come to see him, seeking counsel for his life that had become unmanageable. So what he said to him, Willard said, John, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. Practice the art of slowing. Find at least one important thing in your day that you can do slowly. Maybe it's drinking your tea in the morning. Maybe it's eating dinner with your family. I don't know. What is that thing where you can just rid yourself of distractions and practice slowing? You know what that does for your soul? That's like working out for your spirit. Start slowing down. Step 2, we must reevaluate what we value. We must reevaluate what we value. Now listen, our culture idolizes busyness. In our culture, that is a sign of significance if you're busy. And so here's my suggestion to you and to myself, because I need to put this into practice as well. Make a pact to yourself that anytime anyone asks you how you're doing, you will never answer with the word busy. Anytime anyone asks you how you're doing, you will never answer with the word busy. Even if it's true, even if you are busy, don't say it. Why? Because our culture idolizes busyness. It's an opportunity for us to position ourselves, and that's not good for your soul. Don't answer with the word busyness. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't feed into this sickness that we have. Don't say that you're busy. Eugene Peterson again says, the one piece of mail certain to go unread into my wastebasket is the one addressed to the busy pastor. Not that the phrase doesn't describe me at times, but I refuse to give my attention to someone who encourages what is worst in me. Listen, we will all be busy at times, and it's not that there's something necessarily wrong with busyness, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to cultivate a life of the Spirit, a life with God, you cannot do it if you're frantically busy. It just can't happen. We should stop idolizing busyness. We should pray for people who are busy, you know? Like, it should break our hearts when we see somebody who's just so busy they can't keep it together. That demonstrates some sort of a sickness that needs to be remedied if they're going to have a relationship with their Heavenly Father. Instead of honoring busyness, let's honor faithfulness, acknowledging that, yes, we will all be busy at times. And we shouldn't be lazy with our time either. But that's a different sermon. This one's on busyness. We need to reevaluate what we value in light of who God is. And step number 3, we must learn the art of margin. We must learn the art of margin. What's margin? Margin is the amount available beyond what is necessary. A margin is about building in space in your life to make sure you never hit your limit. Margin is what keeps life from becoming a chaotic mess. Okay, think about the literal margins in a book for a second. Publishers actually spend time researching how much margin they should leave for optimal reading experience. And a lot of books have up to 40% of a page is margin. 40% of the page is blank space. Because in order to be readable, you need that much margin. And if you were to get rid of the margin, you could take 60 pages out of a lot of books. You'd save a lot of paper and a lot of money. But we don't do it because no margin makes the book difficult to read. If you put the words to the edge of the page, it would look like a chaotic mess. Now, many of us would be tempted to think that 40% of margin on a page is a waste of paper. It's wasted space, that is, until you try to read a book without it. And it becomes very difficult. And similarly, most of us think that margin in our schedules is wasted time until you try to live a life without it. Putting margin in your schedule will actually make you more productive. I heard once somebody say that at Google, the company, they have what's called 10% time. And 10% time, that's where they give their employees 10% of their work hours to do whatever they want. It's like recess. And what happens is they hire great people with creative minds, driven people, and so you give them a little bit of free time, they're not going to waste it. And some of the greatest things that Google has come up with were invented during 10% time. Margin does not make you less productive. It makes you more productive, believe it or not. And margin is what will allow us to turn aside from what's urgent to what's important. It's what will allow us to focus on what's best. You see, simplifying your schedule is about much more than just being organized. It's about knowing what matters and what doesn't matter. It's about knowing what you're called to and what you're not called to. It's not just about being savvy about organization or being handy with a device that helps you organize your life. It's about being able to look out at 1,000 different options, point to the one, and say that one and no other. And to do so with a surety and a calmness in your spirit. So let's approach our schedules as an act of worship. And let's realize that how we handle this most precious commodity matters to God. Let's focus not just on doing less, but on doing what's best. The band's going to play one last song, and if you have something that you want to lay before God, if you want to lay your time before Him, you can enact that symbolically by coming to the altar. You can come and kneel before Him. We have kneeling pads up here, and maybe it doesn't even have anything to do with this sermon. Maybe you just have something on your heart, in your life, you just need to bring to God today. We want you to be able to do that here. And so as they play, feel free to come forward and do that. Would you pray with me now? Oh, Jesus, writing a sermon on our schedule at first feels rather unspiritual. But it does not take long, God, to realize that, at least for me, it is crucial. God, help us to focus on the things that are best, rather than running around frantically trying to do all the things we feel like we have to do at the expense of the things that are best. God, give us the courage to say no to the things that we need to say no to. God, give us the strength of soul to be slow, to be present, to be fully there. God, give us the faith to trust you for the rest. Lord, may we honor you in all that we do. May we be people who represent you well. We love you, Jesus. In your name, amen.